I think I've given some of the key ideas here. And I know that a lot of people have come because they've got specific interest, and that some people have visual disabilities or more, so they're really keen to have solutions. So I'm going to sort of open the discussion up at this point. There's one thing I'm very keen to have, which is to focus not on the big important problems, but to focus on the small important problems. And I think that by the end of the year, it's possible to have an online system, in other words, cloud computing system, that allows relatively inexperienced people to produce accessible ephemeral documents that contain mathematical content. The sort of thing I have in mind is homework assignments that contain mathematics. They're ephemeral, or a quiz. A quiz is ephemeral. You write the quiz, the students take the quiz is finished, you write down the answers are distributed. It's ephemeral, it's a page, it's 2 pages. I think we can make progress on that by the end of the year, and that will prime us for further progress in 2022. So that's one of the things I'm throwing into the discussion. And I think at this point, I like a fairly open discussion about your ideas and your problems and your solutions. So anybody want to go in on this? Perhaps the people from the IEEE would like to tell us about their interests and what they'd like to see or what they're able to contribute.
This is good info for my first time. As things progress, maybe I have more inputs.
Do you want to say more?
Jonathan, you're on mute. So I wanted to add one aspect, which I think is a big bottleneck. Jonathan, you mentioned preparing new documents like assignments and class notes. This is in a context where you're creating something new, but there is a slightly harder problem when you have, let's say, existing class notes or a book that already has certain formatting, and sort of adapting, whatever platform we work on. I think this is one of the biggest, like supporting 100% of LaTeX syntax through this conversion pipeline to produce HTML. Right, you can use any macro, right? It's a very broad task. So I would love to hear about challenges of whatever tools we use for converting that can handle the full range of LaTeX.
I can give a response to that, Ivan. I'm afraid it's going to be slogans. The first is act locally, think globally. So solve the small problems that exist around you, but keep your eye on the big problems, because what you're doing in your small problems should, in the end, contribute to the big problems. And the second slogan or motto that I use it a lot in my mathematical research, is what is the simplest problem you can't solve? So if you want to prove the Riemann hypothesis, you say, oh, well, I can't even try to solve that. let me try and find a simpler problem that I can't solve, which takes me towards the Riemann hypothesis. And you keep on going through that until you find that there is a problem that might be within reach. I'm going to show off a little bit of mathematical knowledge. André Weil did that with his Weil conjectures in 1940 or so. And in the 1970s, building on the work of Deligne, on the work of Grothendieck and others, Pierre Deligne solved the Weil conjectures, which contain in them a form of the Riemann hypothesis. So finding the simplest problem you can't solve is the place to start. And when you solve it, you hope that your solution contributes to the global problem. And even if it doesn't contribute to the global problem, it's done something very, very valuable, which is it has shown you and everybody else that that problem can be solved, even though the solution isn't very good. So that's why I'm focused on this year dealing with the ephemera. Not because the big books aren't important, they're very, very important, but they're too difficult, they're out of reach right now. If you want to get to the cookie jar, you don't wait until you grow to be a tall man who can get to the cookie jar at the top of the shelf. Look for a chair and you move the chair and then you can get there. So the first problem you've got is getting hold of the chair. And I think the first problem we've got in some ways is making it possible for anybody who's got a web browser to produce an accessible document that contains mathematics. That can be done if all you want is a PDF document. There's lots of ways of doing that. Overleaf is one. But if you want an accessible document that contains mathematics, the best thing we've got so far is to write a document using Markdown, for example, and use MathJax to render the mathematical content. That's the best route we've got so far to produce a mathematical document, an accessible document that contains mathematics that's easy to use. And the problem with that is that the mathematics rendering isn't very good if you try and render it through the browser. So that's one solution. But if I say any more, I'll be repeating myself further, so I'll stop. I'm very happy to discuss how to solve the big problems.
Oh, no, it makes a lot of sense. I fully agree that I think from what we heard 2 weeks ago, this is a major problem. And when there's a teacher or an intermediary, like a university administrator that can support producing accessible documents, this is a good thing to tackle.
I'd really like to know that we design something that in the long run we can then transfer the output format into LMSs. You want to make sure that it's not something that needs to be in a regular web page, but that people who are using, I don't know, Moodle, Blackboard, Canvas, or whatever, can more or less transfer the output format straight into their LMS as something they can use. And then it would be immediately applicable in the university setting.
Using referring to what we've done before, we want some sort of abstract document tree that represents accessible mathematics. Is that correct, Tani?
Well, you probably want the abstract document tree, but then you want to probably turn it into something relatively HTML based, because I think almost all the LMSs will accept an HTML format, internal format with MathJax. So if you're generating something that in the long run is more or less HTML and you can drop the header and the footer, it'll probably work in almost any LMS. I'm not an expert of all of them. I've seen bits and pieces, but that's a first step that would, if we could easily generate something more pleasantly than using the internal HTML editor in an LMS and MathJax directly, I think it would be very generally applicable in many universities.
So let me put what you said in a slightly different form, which is, suppose we've got something that generates PDF and, so to speak, reasonable HTML from input. That's useful by itself, but then the people that say, oh, well, I want accessible HTML, but I want to put it in my LMS, that's another force. And so we have to solve that force as well. So that's sort of my response is, let's get it working first and check that the output really is accessible to people who are visually disabled and blind. And then refactor the whole thing so that we can get the other outputs we need as well.
I generally agree. I think just we should, as you design the initial version, assume that you want to do something possibly slightly better than putting it in an iframe into some other site.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
And then you're more flexible that it will actually target the systems that are going to use it first.
So in a certain sense, what you want is a group of programmers and a group of onlookers. And the onlookers are saying, well, I'm not sure you should be doing that, and I'm worried about this.
I would say even just as we're doing it, just keep testing it in enough systems that and make sure that it doesn't break too much. Or learn what sort of things you want to do that cause trouble and then figure out how to keep them relatively general.
I've got a slightly different view on this, which is that if the whole thing is a cloud service done via something like continuous integration on GitHub, then somebody who's dissatisfied with the output can actually fork the whole thing and solve their own problem. And then they can make a pull request to the central repository and everybody benefits.
Are you referring to the software side or the actual document side? The software side.
Not changing the documents. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although perhaps you have to change the documents to get the software to work properly. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. I'd like to give the people who have experience of what the problems are an opportunity to talk. So particularly those people who have difficulty managing with ordinary PDFs, if they'd like the opportunity to talk, we'll listen.
Perhaps to make the question slightly more specific, so the MathJax rendering has both version 2 and version 3 has some accessibility tools that are mouse controlled, and I'm not particularly familiar with the details. And there's also regular alt tags. So can someone, like when reading math on the web, what do you hear? What do you see? What do you what are the accessibility features that you have found to be most useful? And if it's an auditory transcription, right, does it read the LaTeX source or does it read some simplified like logical? Do you hear /alpha or /nabla, or do you hear divergent sign?
I think people are a bit shy. Maybe this isn't the right place to produce that sort of feedback and have that sort of conversation. I make it a point whenever I can to stop at 7:30 so that people know that it ends at 7:30. But I won't close the room. Anybody that wants to stay on later is very welcome to stay on later. Please, if you want to stay in touch, provide the email address. It's the only way to ensure that I can send you an email